Now it's time for our 2022 graduation annual report. So I will turn it back to you.
Very good. Thank you. First of all, it is just so wonderful to be doing an annual report. We have done them through COVID, but this is the first time that it has felt like maybe we could have a conversation about an annual report because we've been overshadowed in previous ones. But we have attached the prior reports there, Trustee, the one from last year at this time. And we are here with you this evening and have Mr. Dan Berger coming down, Dr. Dan Berger, coming down to join us, as well as Ms. Parks to support. But before we begin looking at the numbers, we're just always mindful on our graduation data that each of these numbers represents a student and the life that they are hoping to chart to their future. And graduation is that handshake. It is that seminal moment in a student's career. So Mr. Cluley and our communications team have been out, and we're going to share just a very brief video so that you can hear the voices of students. Then we'll crunch the graduation data, and then we'll come back and share a wrap-up, very brief video at that time. Mr. Cluley.
For me, I think it's probably mental health that's just been a factor in my life, I feel like, for a lot of time. But I think that, I don't know, it got difficult last year a lot, but I've kind of come out of the other side most of the time. I think my counselor has been very understanding with letting my teachers know and communicating and kind of prompting that, which is really nice because it's definitely made the times where I've had to go out of school and come back a lot easier for me. I'm going to Hope College, which is really exciting for me. I'm going to double major in neuroscience and Spanish on a pre-med track. Yeah, I think my career goal at least had really morphed, I feel like, after my mental health struggles got harder. At first it was epidemiology, but I feel like that's a lot of stats, but now I feel like I like the people more, and going into neuroscience to eventually get to med school to do psychiatry is definitely something that's helped me, and I would just be able to help other people with that, which is something I would really like to do.
Ever since COVID, I started procrastinating a lot, doing my work. Didn't really, kind of just threw me off my game. Like freshman year, I maintained a 4.0, and then after COVID hit, sort of lost all inspiration, all hope. Just kind of gave up. And then this year I found the home building program, and it helped me turn things around. I just found something that I really enjoyed doing. The coaches there, they're wonderful. I love both of them. They both gave me a lot of inspiration, a lot of help. They're helping me find a job right now in the field. They're helping me apply to Washington for a construction management degree as well. Yeah, I'm hoping to work in the field as well. At the same time, I'm probably going to do probably a framing apprenticeship, because that's what I enjoy the most about the trades, is framing.
So I lived with my parents until 8th grade, like second semester, and I did technically move back to Korea, but then I felt like Korean education was not for me because I spent so much time here. So I just decided to come back, and I was the only one who could come back at that time. So I found a host family and I stayed with them. And it was definitely challenging at first. I really missed my family. Yeah, I went back to Korea for online year, COVID year, because it was all online, virtual, and then I didn't find the reason to just stay here when I could be with my family. So I went back, and it was kind of weird because I had to open like Zoom meeting at 10 p.m. when everyone's like at 8 a.m. and like it's like sunshine in the background, and I'm just like, it's like dark for me. I'm gonna be going to University of Michigan, and I'm gonna be studying biology.
Middle school, I remember being stressed like all the time, and then teachers saying like, oh, middle school matters, because these are your grades for high school, but really it was like only 8th grade. But I think that like the way that they teach, like, your curriculum, staying on top of your classes, your work, helped me set up for like high school, making it not so like overwhelming. But yeah, I do procrastinate a lot, but like I get like my work done. Online, it kind of helped me reset like my schedule, how I do school. I also got closer to teachers because I was always emailing them, and I will be attending the University of Pittsburgh as a pre-med major. So health sciences here at Pioneer. It's a class, we learn about the different body systems. Second semester, we've had clinicals, So I was actually like at U of M, at St. Joe's, at different clinicals, and I got to shadow doctors, and I was set on becoming an OBGYN.
Thank you, Mr. Cleary. Great job. So, trustees will jump into the 2022 graduation report. So I will start with an introduction, and then Dr. Berger, go ahead and get settled. Over time, trustees who have served know that over time we have redesigned our high school support system to support a wider continuum of student need. So I'll be very brief, but trustees, for those who may not know the history, when at a Listen and Learn back in 2014, we heard very clearly from our community that while Ann Arbor seemed to do a fine job with traditionally well-prepared students, that our community shared with us that they didn't feel that for students who were not on that 4 years of a comprehensive high school, 4 years of a college degree, 2 years of graduate school, they felt like we didn't have much for students who might be thinking about another path. And so from that time, 2015, we took two very small alternative programs and combined them, moved that location into the center of the city and put it on a bus line. Our prior location was not a location that students could get to on public transportation. So we intentionally designed the Pathways program, which was the joining together of A2 Tech and Roberto Clemente, two very small prior programs. And we developed that program at Pathways so that students could not only take every course they needed for graduation, and that was not true at the prior locations, so they could take every course there. And also, we have a robust credit recovery that is a small staffing ratio, 12 to 15 to 1 at that small high school program. In addition, we placed credit recovery supports in every high school location. A few years ago, if a student lost a credit and needed to recover that, they had to drive across town to a particular location, and obviously that was a barrier. So we now have great teachers and support staff and credit recovery in every location. We have also used on a limited basis some of the intensive credit recovery programming. The name of the program we use is called Grad Alliance. This partner of ours also does that contact and reconnection of students with whom we've lost contact. So one of our gaps before this several years of concentrated work was that if we lost contact with students, often it was hard to get that back. And so Grad Alliance does that. Now, the way that Grad Alliance approaches things is really from we will get you graduated. They do provide a mentor. They do offer the laptop. It is a virtual delivery, but we are using that particularly for students whose struggles have become so significant that they're no longer able to attend school. So this has become one thing. One thing that I want to make sure we share is that the board has been clear through these years of work that we were not going to compromise the expectation. So we have maintained the higher graduation criteria of 22 credits. The state requires 18. We have maintained that higher requirement of credits, while also providing many more supports for students to reach the goal. One of the stated goals around creating the Pathways campus was to ensure that older students had a place where they felt comfortable. And so the internships with Zingerman's, the work study, the enrollment at Washtenaw Community College that occurs is really designed for students to choose their pathway. It may be a pathway for a student who's reached a point where they really don't want to return to high school. They just want to get the diploma and move forward with their lives. So I want to summarize by saying the approach that we've had has continued the high expectations, but also providing a great deal more support to reach that expectation. What we've seen as a result that you'll see as Dr. Berger lays it out is we are currently at 89% on our 4-year on time. That has normalized back to the pre-COVID levels. And just like with our trustees, you recall, just like with our achievement data, we put a little bit of a parentheses around a couple of years there. So now we are seeing our levels back where we saw them in 2019. We also are seeing a real increase in our 5 and 6 year rates, particularly with 3 of our 5 focus groups. So you will see it in a moment. African Americans over previous years moving 6 percentage points on that 5-year rate, 83% to 89%. Hispanic students moving 8 percentage points, 82% to 90%. And students from poverty moving 8 percentage points, 78% to 86%. Trustees, those are significant gains nestled in that 5 and 6 year data. So what we've essentially accomplished, and we have a great deal more work to do, so just watch us because we're on a roll here. But what we have essentially seen is that it has become okay and supported for students to persist with us an additional year or even 2 years to achieve that goal of high school graduation. We're very, very proud of that progress. Now, what you will see in this data report will show all of the celebrations and the concerns. We continue to have concerns in our 5 areas that we always focus on, and I will point out that special education graduation rates have remained fairly steady, and there is a significant disparity there. Just a reminder, when you look at that data, if a child on an IEP can either be, based on their needs, either on a diploma track or on the certificate track. And a reminder, trustees, because this is all very technical, if they are on the certificate track, they will never be a part of that graduation checked data. They certainly do graduate, and we walk and shake their hands and celebrate, but it is a certificate, not a diploma for those students, depending on their IEP. The one standout that you will see in the data, trustees, is the English learner data. Dr. Berger will speak with you more about this. What has happened over previous years with EL data, English language learner data, is that our group has tripled in size, and the nature of that group is very different. Years ago, we certainly had English language learners, but what we're seeing now is we're delighted for it, a large move-in of newcomer students. And these are students who are arriving to Ann Arbor in their teen years. I remember last graduation season shaking hands of immigrants and newcomers who had just arrived a few weeks before graduation. So this is indeed a completely different picture. So when you see that roller coaster in the English language learner data, we have a plan. Huda Harajli is on the mission, but this is a completely different group that has evolved, and we're very delighted that they're with us, and yet it does show in this graduation data. So with that, Dr. Berger's ready to go.
Good evening, everyone. As Dr. Swift introduced for you, we have our regular report of the AAPS graduation rates for 2022. Just a reminder that these are looking at last year's graduation rates, not the students that are graduating now. There's quite a bit of lag from the state on those results officially. So we'll look at the AAPS four-year graduation rates over time, how our rates compare to statewide, county, and similar and high-performing districts. And we will also look at our 4, 5, and 6-year graduation rates over time by student groups. And finally, we'll look at the dropout rates for the Ann Arbor Public Schools. So if you can go to slide 5, please. Our first display presents the Ann Arbor Public Schools 4-year graduation rate over the last 10 years. As you can see in looking at the purple dash line, our 4-year trend line is increasing over the prior 10 years, but also that 2022 represents a dip from the prior 2 years' graduation rates. As Dr. Swift mentioned, there were some different things going on during the 2 years when we had a lot of different effects of the pandemic happening, and some of the people who are practitioners can speak to some of that better than I can. But when I look at this, I see that this is, a return to our pre-COVID graduation rates, and a little bit different from 20 and 22, which were very different years. And we'll look more closely at our grad rates over time in a bit, as well as the 5 and 6 year rates that Dr. Swift was mentioning. But prior to that, we're first going to turn our attention to some comparisons between Ann Arbor Public Schools and other entities, other districts, and the state in general. So if you go to slide 6, before we jump into all that, I just want to kind of do, by way of executive summary, the key takeaways that we want you to look for here. First of all, the overall Ann Arbor Public School 4-year graduation rate has returned to a value close to prior pre-COVID years. The 4-year graduation rates overall, and for most of our demographic groups that we examine, have an upward trend on the 4-year line over the last 10 years. So you'll see we have these purple dashed lines that are our 4-year trend lines. And with the exception of one group, they're all going up, which is what we want to see. And the exception to that, of course, as Dr. Swift already mentioned, is our English learner population. And so that's probably our biggest area where there's a room for growth. Our graduation rates have remained relatively stable in comparison to county, to similar districts, and to high-performing districts overall, and also to similar districts in our 5 focus groups, and we'll unpack all of that in slides coming up. There is, as always, room for growth in our relative position for our 5 focus groups. The 5 and 6 year graduation rates over time have increased among some of our traditionally underserved student groups. So hopefully that means we're serving some people better than we used to be. And interestingly, in looking at the 5-year 2021 graduation rates, so going back a year because now we have 5-year data for those, we see that overall, as well as in many of our demographic groups, the 5-year rate for 2021 already meets or exceeds the prior 10 years 6-year graduation rates. So that's a really good result, I think, that we are, when we get the 6-year rate, it should go up even higher yet. So we're doing well there. Slide 9 starts our comparisons, and this compares 2022 4-year rates by student group to the entire state of Michigan. As you can see, we have higher graduation rates than the state at large across all the groups that we're looking at here, with the exception of English learners, where we're just a little bit below the state 4-year graduation rate. If you go to slide 10, this looks at other districts. This is going to be kind of a crazy slide, but this will be broken down over the next several slides, so don't worry about trying to get everything here at once. But this provides an overview of a comparison of the Ann Arbor Public School 4-year graduation rate to an assortment of districts. At the top, the county districts, followed by similar districts and high-performing districts. We will look more carefully at each of these groups over the next several slides, as I said, but I want to take just a moment here to orient you. The next several slides are all sort of set up this similar way. There's a left panel and a right panel. The left panel represents the graduation rate, and the Ann Arbor Public Schools rate is shown through all the others with that blue dashed line for easier comparison. The right panel represents the number of students in each graduating class. The darker part of the bar in the right panel is the students who graduated, and the lighter part is the students that did not graduate. And the number at the end is the total size of the graduation class cohort.
A question.
Yeah.
So if I may clarify,
Yes.
You mentioned earlier, and this was a little bit of a question, I have slide 10, so if you can, or page 10, if we could go back to that. You mentioned on the right-hand side were the number of students, the
Yep.
darker area were those students who we managed to get across,
Yes.
as graduates,
Yes.
and then the lighter shade were the number of students total in that class.
No. So
Okay, no,
the,
okay.
the long bar, so for this, the 1091 is the total students in the cohort.
Okay.
This is the students that graduated, and this is the students that did not graduate within 4 years.
Okay, so somewhere, I didn't see it in this presentation, but I know somewhere in your stack of numbers, you can actually break out the darker number, which are the number of students that managed to graduate. Okay, thank you.
I don't have that available right now.
No,
but
I
definitely do
understand
have
that totally,
yes.
because initially when I looked at, for example, Whitmore Lake, 84.5% graduation rate, 71, that's a total in the class, yet they weren't able to pull all 71 across the stage, so to speak.
Right.
So, but it looks very close, but again, it's not a total of 71. So thank you. I just wanted to clarify that.
Do we have another question over here?
Trustee Schmidt.
Okay. Something that when I went through this data in committee that I thought was interesting is that the kids that didn't make it over the line, they're listed, we would say dropouts. Or no, that's
No.
a different category. Okay.
That's a different category.
Got
So
it.
dropout is a very specific thing. And actually, those are later in the slideshow. We have
Okay,
the
we'll
exact
wait on that.
definitions. But someone who did not finish in 4 years could be a continuing student where we expect them to continue on for a 5th year, potentially a 6th year. They could be a special education student who is going to complete a certificate. There are other buckets that sort of they could be in that are not a dropout.
Gotcha.
So when we say that 89.2% graduated, that does not mean that 10.8% dropped out. Not at all. That is not what that means.
They just haven't graduated
They
yet.
just haven't graduated yet at that 4-year
Okay.
point. Correct.
Thank you.
Dr. Berger, if I may ask you to, since we're early in this, I would love just a couple of things sort of more defined. One is how are we measuring what does high performing district mean? And also what is the sort of if there is a measure for what is this category called? Economically disadvantaged. What's
Yes.
the measure for that?
Thank you. I'll start and then Dr. Berger will help. Trustees, these batches of comparisons are ones that have been curated by the board over a decade, and they are imperfect. They're extremely imperfect. And so one of your documents attached is all of the demographic data that Dr. Berger put together about all of these comparison districts. When you take a moment to review, it's a 2-page document attached. When you take a moment to review it, you realize there's really no district like Ann Arbor. And by that, I mean as widely diverse, as large, and as variously impacted. That we do not say that to say we're not going to be accountable to graduate kids. Our many years of work says we want to be accountable to graduate 100%. But the board's desire, first of all, the county districts, trustees have felt that just needs to be there because they're geographically around us. The second batch, similar, meaning along some criteria, there's some semblance of similarity. But on each one of those, when you look at them, there's some glaring ways in which they are not at all like us. So if this board moves forward, that might be the bucket that, it deserves more look. Now, there have been times in the past where we would compare nationally and take a Madison, Wisconsin, other university towns. That is also imperfect, but we've done that before. The final one is the high performing. Now, Dr. Berger will note with you, those are not necessarily the highest performing districts, but the board's desire was pick those larger districts that when you all go to conferences, we're typically talking to those folks because we have a lot in common. And so as a statistician, I'm sure Dr. Berger finds this comparison batching very unsatisfying, but it has been the way we've done it. Now, second thing is poverty is by the designation free and reduced lunch. So it is that federal designation.
Okay. And so just to clarify, like high performing doesn't mean one measure. It's
so high performing in this realm just basically means a really high graduation rate.
I see. Okay.
So that's why they're high performing on the graduation rate.
Thank you.
Please, and if I may, in the past, these were schools, if you did anything competitively in the state, you would see them there.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it would be academic games, the debate team, athletics, you would constantly see these particular schools. And so they were anecdotally, those are the high performing schools, if you will. As Dr. Swift and Dr. Berger said, there is no concrete, there's nothing like Ann Arbor, but we also know there were schools that weren't like Ann Arbor. Yeah. So it was not fair to compare ourselves, say, to Whitmore Lake, who a smaller school district, limited budget, not the diversity that, we have in Ann Arbor. So we spread ourselves out in looking at schools that, okay, they're kind of like us. Again, we see they are competitive in every way. And so that's how we got to the quote unquote high performing schools.
Right. And if you're a historian, you would look at our data reports and see that every measure, not just graduation rate, used these same buckets. So for a very long time. Yeah.
Trustee Schmidt. Trustee Dupree.
So I just had a couple of relatively quick questions. One, I think I asked this like a time ago, but I wanted to make sure I remember. So say I know we're not showing like cross sections or like intersections here, but say that we had a student that was African American and then also economically disadvantaged.
Right.
Which category would that student be counted in as it relates to graduation?
They'll show in both categories in these numbers. Yep, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so some of the students would be double counted in different categories in that way.
Or even triple counted if they had an IEP on top,
sure,
or
if they're also a
English
student
learner.
with a disability or an English learner,
Trustee Schmidt.
So I'm going to hope my memory serves me well here. But one thing that I think is really important to remember, when 1994 happened and we went to per pupil funding, a school like Birmingham, that one sticks in my mind because I was on the school board very soon after 94 in East Lansing. They were locked in at like 13,000 a student, and we were at 7,200 in East Lansing. And it was just like, if anybody wants, it was ridiculous.
It is.
And you're going, and so all this time while we've been trying to even stuff up, now granted, their monies have come down, but then they create endowments and stuff. It's not an even playing field when you have a school district making almost twice as much per child. And I know this district, if we look at the history here, it was around 9,000 in 2008. So I know it was probably in the 7,000s back then. So just something to, money helps us do a lot of things.
Trustee Mohammed.
I keep calling people.
Trustee
Okay. Sorry, I
Dupree.
had a couple more that I didn't get a chance. But so considering that we have some schools where the entire school qualifies for free or reduced lunch, does that affect the category of economically disadvantaged in any way, or does it change the way that we report that or anything like that?
This is looking at the whole district. So if someone has that free and reduced price lunch tag, then they'll be in that group. irregardless of which building they're a member of.
Gotcha.
I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers the question or not.
It does, because
Okay.
I was, like I said, I was curious
Sure.
because right now we have a couple of schools where the entire school can get.
Yes. For the food
Not high
program
school.
and other Title I support, it does make a difference. But on this report, it wouldn't.
Right. Okay. And when we're looking at districts that are comparable to ours or similar to ours, what are some things that stand out that make them similar to our district?
So I will have to let someone else speak to that because this is a legacy list that I inherited when I took on this role. I'm happy to help revisit it if we want to do that at some point and look more carefully at those. I don't know if you can speak to that, Dr. Swift.
Yes, one of the things the trustees really were looking for was diversity, because the large part of Michigan, as we all know, is not diverse. And so they wanted districts with some diversity, wider diversity. So you can see a Utica and, others on that list, but also size. And you can see the line that covers size really isn't perfectly, but like Utica is one of the top 5 largest districts, as we are also. It is imperfect, but another area they looked at back in the years when we were doing analyzing this for comparison was poverty rate. Is that many districts in Michigan do not have a very, like our county surrounding, there are several surrounding districts that don't have very much poverty. And so the goal was to get some in that bucket with poverty, some that were larger districts, so just trying to find some ways of comparing.
I know this is a lot of data, so I'm glad that we're taking pauses. So for the overall numbers, so I'm calculating about, and maybe I'm wrong, that the 15, 13, that's the end.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm calculating about maybe 178 total students.
Seems about right.
So of those, have we really, and I know it's especially when you're looking at like subgroups, have we done kind of a deeper dive of the demographics of those that did not graduate?
Well, we will be able to look at the graduation rates for each of the individual groups later in this presentation.
Okay. Well, but I guess my question is, I understand there are going to be different subgroups, but I'm assuming the 178 sometimes don't belong in those subgroups. Does that make sense? Maybe they do.
Well, I mean, we're going to look individually at white students, Asian students,
Okay.
African American students, economically disadvantaged students, et cetera. So maybe if we get through those and there's another group you'd like to see, we can look at that.
Okay.
So I think what you're saying, Dr. Berger, is, for example, when we look at a group of students, it will show the in size and the graduation number. So we'll be able to see the number who did not graduate.
So you can calculate the number
on
that did
time.
not graduate. Yeah.
In
Yeah,
that
I
slide.
think I'm more leaning towards, I mean, maybe this is a question at the end, but like, have we really looked at, like, done a root cause analysis? Because I understand we
Yes.
can look at the different subgroups, but as
Sure.
you go, I mean, this is only what I calculated for all of those, when looking at all the subgroups, it was about 240 something, but the ends become smaller as you go into each, like it's like 50 students here, 30 students. So I'm looking at it from the other side. Have we done, and again, this could be saved at the end about the root cause analysis.
We absolutely have. And that's what our several year plan was based on, is what we discovered was that students needed real time, immediate credit recovery right here with them, that they needed many, many supports they did not have, that some of them who were older needed a place that they wanted to go to that was different from a comprehensive high school. So we've based that on a root cause analysis. We would look more at the 5-year rate, though, than this 4-year, because that really shows who we're not getting across in 5 years. because we do see that big trend of getting students to the goal in the 5th year. But yes, I understand your question, and we are ready to take this data and do that next chapter. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, Trustee Carrera.
I think I have the same question that Trustee Muhammad has. Let me give it a shot. So what I'm looking at is the 89.2% of the 1513 line. So that means that 10.8% didn't make it over. And so I calculate, is that right?
Within 4 years.
Yeah, within the 4-year span. So 10.8 is about 163 students, if I'm right. And so what I think Trustee Muhammad's asking is, what is the demographic breakdown of those 163 students, and do they fall in multiple categories?
So I think when we do the student groups,
sure,
you will see the number of graduates, and it'll be easy to see the number who did not graduate on that same slide coming up.
Okay.
You'll be able to see that.
Sure.
Well, I don't think you'll get exactly what you're looking for.
I don't think
because
so.
You're not going to get that intersection of groups. You're going to get the groups individually. It sounds to me like what you're asking about is an intersection. Like, of those students, how many of them are, students with disabilities and economically disadvantaged?
That's what I'm
the
asking.
intersection of more than one thing. So we're not going to see that today. It's certainly something that we could do later if we wanted to do that. The only thing I'm concerned about is we're going to start getting into a small n problem. Once we get, if you start with 160 some students and then you break it into like intersection, you very quickly get less than 10, and then it could be identifiable. So while we can look at that internally, I wouldn't want to present anything publicly that would get too small of an n problem.
Well, and I think, do you not run into the fact that students can fall into multiple categories? As we mentioned before, we could have an African-American child who is an English language learner impacted by poverty with an IEP.
Well, I think that's the exact question that you're asking, right?
Well, it wouldn't matter, because if they were they would count in multiple categories still, in the same that we calculated. But I guess what's behind that question is obviously to reveal what I think we can all assume. I think the data points to that those groups are the ones who typically will struggle the most. I really trying to get a number around how many people we have in a 5 to 6 year program, and run that against how much are we paying for this, so that I could put those numbers together, and then to calculate the investment that we're putting into some of our most marginalized groups. I mean, that's kind of where to show our efforts in trying to make sure that these students do persist and that they do graduate in an overall picture, if that makes sense. Why I'm not asking it to be to accuse us of anything, but just to highlight our effort in uplifting those who, for whatever reason, weren't as successful in the same time frame.
It makes perfect sense, and I appreciate both Trustee Carrero and Trustee Muhammad's question. This is the work that we do. We have not reported it because of the small in size. It is, we will see at graduation next week examples of students who are doing that in the 5th year. It is extremely expensive. Our Pathways program is built at a staffing ratio of less than half of a normal high school staffing ratio. More than twice. So 15 to 1 as opposed to, a regular high school program. So it is very expensive, but if we had a magic wand, we would add graduate coaching. We could add the next 5 strategies if money were not an object. But it is very expensive, the programming, and I'm proud that we do it.
Yeah, and I'm not looking for an answer to the question, but just really a comment for others to think about, which is that if we're at 12 to 15 at one school, and I heard you say earlier in the initial overview that we do credit recovery now at all the schools.
We
I'm
do.
just curious about, and I heard you follow up and say that we're doing that virtually. That Grad Alliance is basically a virtual.
Grad Alliance is, but the credit recovery
is not.
It can be, but mostly it is done right at the school.
Okay.
And those groups are typically smaller.
Okay, they're not
And-
12. They're not 12 typically.
They're pretty small. I mean,
Okay.
Ms. Parks can speak more to that when she answers your questions later, but they are quite small.
Yeah, I just trying to keep our head on not just the number but how much it'll cost and
Yes.
what we're putting into it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Schmidt.
I just want to, I looked things up instead of just going by my memory here. So to be fair, some of the schools up there are like in 2019, Birmingham was getting 12,284 a child, Farmington 10,450, and we were at 9,530. But I will have to say some of the other schools, the small ones like Northville and such, they were in our group. But just want to make sure I'm being accurate.
Thank you.
Yeah, Trustee Mohammed.
Okay. And I know, again, the ends are going to be even smaller, but have we looked at maybe internally even how each school, the graduation rates per school?
Yes.
Okay.
The school principals work with their executive director and Ms. Parks, and that is an internal process. This is system data, so we are very specific about reporting it this way. But yes, thank you for that. That is an excellent question.
Are you ready?
All
Go
right.
on.
If we can go to slide 11 then. Slide 11 is sort of part of the prior slide, and it provides a detailed look at the 2022 AAPS four-year graduation rate compared to other districts within the county. You can see we sit right in the middle with 4 of the districts above and 4 of the districts below our graduation rate. And as you can see from the right panel, though, this isn't a great comparison because the largest of these graduating classes is less than a third of the size of Ann Arbor. And incidentally, if you look at your background materials, the other districts in our county also are not very demographically similar to Ann Arbor. So, we put it up here because we share a county, but it's not a great comparison along many axes, really. So slide 12 then attempts to ameliorate some of these comparison issues by comparing our 2022 rates with a set of sort of quote unquote similar districts. And while no comparison is perfect, these are at least somewhat similar in size and demographic makeup to Ann Arbor Public Schools. As you can see here, the graduation rates in this set are really quite close to one another generally. So, I don't know, there's a whole lot to say. It's kind of similar with the similar districts. And if we move to slide 13, we'll finish that with the high-performing districts. So much like the prior 2 slides, again, we're making the same kind of comparison, this time to a set of high-performing districts in the state. And as might be expected by the title high-performing districts, these high-performing districts have higher graduation rates. And we do this comparison because we feel it's important to compare ourselves, hold ourselves to a standard of comparison against the best and other ways as well. So then we consider this. And for context, these districts, the 5 districts that we have here as high performing, lie between the 81st and the 97th percentile for graduation rates in Michigan. So.
One thing I think when comparing schools, just like admissions offices at universities, and I'm not questioning the quality of these schools, but an A in one school, it could be different than an A in another school. And being able to pass through classes to get to graduation can vary school to school, what the expectations are. It's not like Florida. I think they still have an exit exam. To be able to graduate in the state of Florida, you have to take an exam. So it's up to each school. So I think that's one comment I have. And then a question for you, Dr. Swift. So the state requirements, they've changed them over times when Granholm was governor and we added all those classes.
Yes.
So you're telling me right now the requirement is how many credits for this from the state?
18 from the state.
And we are at 22.
22.
And so it would be interesting to see what these schools are, if they're sitting at 22 also.
Actually, Dr. Thompson did a little check-in with them, and some are running a few more than we require, and then some are a little bit less than what we require. And we found 1 or 2 that have changed during COVID, which we're not surprised.
As Like they went down or went up from there?
They reduced during COVID.
Interesting.
So, if
Trustee
I may,
Biscuit.
So during the COVID years especially, in the MASB conversations, there were school districts that self-identified because they were worried about that they did change, because they were worried about their graduation rates, because they knew they'd be hit and that their community would be very upset.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they've changed to go back up, and once you take something away, trying to add it back will be a little difficult at times. So school districts, school boards had to consider a lot of stuff during the last couple of years, and also budgets, as you very well know as our treasurer. So there was a lot going on in terms of keeping our standards, but also being mindful of the budget, the staffing, and again, the community expectations.
I would also add that 2011-12 was the beginning of what you noted, Trustee, and thank you for noting that, was a significant increase in the requirements. Those of you who are around recall that second 2 years of world language and
Algebra 2.
And Algebra 2. And so we have often used the number of years we use because these have been pretty consistent on state requirements, although it may be that world language was added in the early parts of these windows. But that did cause a change in graduation rate, particularly the second year of algebra.
So prior to that, if you wanted, for a lot of people who said, I want to go to college, they would get 2 years or more of a language. It was before that you didn't need to have a language to graduate in the state of Michigan. You didn't need Algebra 2 to graduate, and then that was changed. And that was a movement to make every student college ready, which is a laudable idea, but then it left out a lot of kids who maybe want to do another track. Not everybody goes to college. So we are starting to right that ship now by looking at other kinds of programming within schools to say we shouldn't expect every child to go to college. That's not realistic. They may not want to.
Yeah.
All right, if we go to slide 14, we're looking at a similar setup of the slides that we looked at before. Again, this is going to be broken down over the next several slides, so you don't have to take everything in here. But this considers the Ann Arbor graduation rate performance of our 5 focus groups of students against a set of legacy comparison districts again. Much like the prior set of comparisons over the next several slides, we'll take a more detailed look at each of these. So if we just go to slide 15, we can look at our first comparison group. So this looks at Ann Arbor Public Schools Black or African American student performance compared to our a group of 4 comparison districts. On the bottom of this in the next several slides, I've also incorporated the overall graduation rate for each of those districts just for context. And as you can see, in our set of the 5 schools that we have here, Ann Arbor is the second from the bottom, and there's a gap between our overall rate and the rate of graduation in 4 years for our Black or African American students. So we do have growth that we need to do to serve this set of students as well as we do the students as a whole. Slide 16 presents a similar comparative look at our Hispanic or Latinx students. Again, we see that Ann Arbor is second from the bottom in this set of 5. And again, this is an area that we can continue to grow in. Slide 17 tells the same story for our students with disabilities, second from the bottom again. Slide 18 tells the same story for our economically disadvantaged students. And finally, slide 19 presents a comparison of a set of 5 districts for our English learners. You can see here that our performance is at this lowest of these 5 groups, and this is the area where probably the most growth is needed at current time.
So tell me again, and Trustee Basquette there, why did they choose these schools? Why are these schools chosen?
There were, again, we wanted to look at when people would say, well, you're a rich school, so it's not fair to compare yourself to a school with less money. So then we looked, for example, at Troy. Mm-hmm. Troy has, they're a well-educated population. They have high expectations as well. So we threw Troy in there. And then when you looked at Farmington, again, you will see, as Dr. Burgers have gone through the subgroups, you'll see, well, look, Troy had 67 students of with special education compared to our 171, you know. So yeah, that's not perfect, but we just kind of threw some school districts around that we are in there that were around us. So they weren't in the UP per se, you know, so they're there. So again, it was what we had at the time.
And I'll say again, I'm open to revisiting those and doing some propensity score matching or something if we want to do that in the future.
There is no real apples to apples, though.
I know, of course.
That's the problem,
as,
right?
so we have to think of what's relevant data to look
Right.
at.
I mean, at one point in the past, we compared ourselves to Detroit Public Schools.
Yeah.
Was that fair?
Sure.
No. And the
So-
desire would be to have a consistent comparison. So
Exactly.
I look forward to our conversations, but wherever we go with it, we will want to do all of our data that way.
Right.
And at one time, too, we are part of the Minority Student Achievement Network. We compared,
Yes.
as Dr. Swift, mentioned, we compared ourselves to other college school or
Yeah.
college town schools.
Yes.
Well educated, have a little bit of money. And again, was that fair? Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But yeah, it's
It's
it's arbitrary
yeah, yeah.
in that sense.
Trustee Mohammed.
So I just wanted to clarify. So just the big thing is, and I understand, I appreciate the document that was provided that compared the percentages, because I see how there's like the negative, like for example, talking about the example about Troy and Ann Arbor Public Schools, even though the end is different, but the percentage change is less based on the document you gave us about the percent changes. It is less by like 2.9 or 2.79%. So the big thing is just keep in mind that we don't want to look at ends as much, but more of the percentages when we're comparing schools.
Right. And
Okay.
one of the pages of the background document that I gave you actually has a plus minus of
Yeah.
each district compared to Ann Arbor Public Schools. So you don't have to do the math in your head. I just kind of did that for you. So
Trustee Dupree.
Just a real quick follow up about the schools that we are comparing to ourselves. So, what year were these schools chosen? And if we revisit this, is that up to the performance committee to decide when we revisit whether or not these?
I appreciate that question. And that really, Trustee Dupree, evolved over time. Because it was unsatisfying to not have some different ways of looking at the data. And the community often compares us to our neighbors. So that part was pretty obvious. But then there was a desire to say, no one's exactly like us, but if we were picking some, who might that be? So it's been several years. We can revisit that. That is a general, I am listening tonight. I listen in every data discussion. That is a general consensus among the board as to how you would like to see the data extrapolated. I don't believe we will find any more or less similar districts, but, and I know that the time that Dr. Berger has for this effort is quite limited because of his responsibilities, but we absolutely can pursue that. This is what we have now for looking at our data. So, but we can have that discussion. Yeah.
Trustee Carrera.
Just like to add, I think when we look at these schools, it's more of are there any schools we want to add? Because I don't think that we could project into we would be remiss in dropping some of these schools and not trapping them so that we couldn't look over time. And so if I think the approach would be thinking about, do we need to revisit these schools? I think a better approach would be to think about, are there schools that we think would be useful to add to the list of schools as by way of we see a different comparison point with that particular district? I can't imagine us ever having, for example, a slide of data and not have Plymouth Canton schools up there because they're our neighbor. And obviously because of school of choice, we'll have movement between students back and forth. So that school on that list will always be there. And I feel that another one is like Rochester as well and Novi. So some of these schools that are very similar to us, I don't think it would be right for us to have looked at the data for them for 4, 5, 6, 7 years and then drop them off because that would be just information we're missing out on.
Trustee Gaynor?
We're obsessing over these details. I'm still waiting for some valid conclusions to be drawn. I don't know if the obsessing is getting us anywhere. More important that we ask some of the bigger questions, which I think can wait till the end of the presentation.
Dr. Berg?
All right. Should I continue? All right.
Sure. Thank you.
Great. So slide 20 turns our attention to the Ann Arbor Public School graduation rates over time. So again, these are going to be broken down, but this is a broad view of our 4-year rates, which are the blue bars, our 6-year graduation rates, which are the purple caps on top of the blue bars. That's the extra number that got over the graduation threshold in 6 years, as well as the 4-year trend line, which is the line in darker purple that you see going over it. And you can see, please note that the 4-year trend is increasing across all students and for all groups over the last 10 years, with the exception of English learner students, which we've mentioned. So over the next 9 slides, we'll take a closer look at each of these, along with the 5- and 6-year graduation rates, and keep the 4-year trend line intact. So if you go to slide 21, having looked at the 4-year trends across the board, so one of our key findings is in our 5- and 6-year graduation rates, which we've looked at, which we talked about earlier. So over these couple of slides, you can see that there's an increase in our 5-year rate from 2021. If you look at this, you can see that there is some closing among African American students, Hispanic students, and economically disadvantaged students on our 5-year graduation rate between the all students, which is the blue line at the top, and the green line at the bottom. So that shaded light blue area is the gap between those two. And you can see that for the 5-year rate on the top 3 groups, that's shrinking a little bit over time, which is a good outcome. We're not seeing that, however, with the English learners or students with disabilities in the same way. And if you go to the next slide, this is the same basic thing, but looking at 6-year graduation rates on slide 22. And you can see again, on the top 3, it's a little bit less pronounced, but you can see that it's narrowing a bit over time. For the 6-year graduation rates for those top 3, the same 3 groups that the 5-year was, and not for the English learner group or our students with disabilities.
With the students with disabilities, and you mentioned this earlier, I just want to make sure I understand. So some students on an IEP will do the certificate of completion.
Yes.
So when I think of the total number of children that we're trying to graduate, the ones that got the diploma will show, but the other ones, how
they will not.
They're going to show as not graduating.
The other ones, yeah, those would be not graduated, according to the Michigan definitions.
Even though there was a completion and they fulfilled what they cognitively are able to do.
Yes.
If it's not an official graduation, it is not part of the graduation rate, according to the state. Yep. Okay, so that's that part. Slide 23 presents our 4-, 5-, and 6-year graduation rates over the past 10 years for all students. So because the next several graphs are going to look the same, I'm going to kind of break down what the different parts are here. The blue bars and the dashed purple 4-year trend line for this one are what you saw at the top of the presentation, all students, 4-year graduation rates, and our 4-year trend line. I've also included here our 5-year rate in green and our 6-year rate in the lighter purple, and there's the percent values that go with all of those. The population of students for each year, or the N, is in white at the bottom of each bar. So you can see the total number of students that are considered part of that graduation cohort. And a trend that I want to point out now that's a shift in our thinking about graduation rates is that in the past, the 4-year graduation rate was kind of the main thing we focused on. But as Dr. Swift mentioned, we're thinking more and more about how to keep students engaged and get them to graduate in a longer period of time, potentially in the 5- and 6-year rate. And so this is evident here in the fact that our 5-year graduation rate in 2021 is actually higher than any of our 6-year graduation rates in the prior years before that. So we're getting more people in that 5 years over the graduation mark, which is great. I mean, that's what we were trying to do. That's what the policies that have put into place are in part trying to do, is to keep those students with us, keep them engaged, and allow them to graduate.
And that increase, Dr. Berger, from our other data appears to be driven by traditionally underserved students. And is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think, that is a fair statement. Yep. Because we don't see that as strongly with some of the other groups of students when we look at the individual breakdowns in the next few slides here.
Thank you.
So rather than dropping out or leaving with some of that stigma being removed on the 5 and 6 year, we're getting more people to graduate, which is great. Slide 24 is a similar look for our Black or African American students. So just kind of quick shorthand, I'll say, our trend line is increasing over 4 years. And again, if you look at our 5-year graduation rate, it's higher than any of our prior 6-year graduation rates, which is, this is going to keep coming up as we go through these slides, that's the case. Slide 25 looks at our Asian or Asian American students. In this group, we have generally high performance, but the trend line, if you look at it, it is still slightly inching up over time. It's an increasing trend line. Slide 26 looks at our Hispanic or Latinx students. And here you can see the trend line is increasing over 4 years. This is actually one of our groups that had an increase in the grad rate from 21 to 22. Slight, but it increases an increase, and we're happy about that. And again, the 5-year rate here is higher than any of the prior 6-year rates again. If you go to slide 27, this is our students with 2 or more races. Again, our trend line is increasing over the 4 years, and our 5-year rate is higher than any but one of the prior 6-year rates.
Trustee Gaynor?
I'd like to mention this now while we have this data and this trend line, and it's a bit a pet peeve of mine and only minor mathematical significance, because 2013 was a bit of an outlier, low compared and in general across. And 20 and 21 was slightly in general higher, not on every slide, but certainly on the overall rate and on many of them. But 20 and 21 are a bit higher, and I'm assuming it was because the criterion for passing classes was a little bit more relaxed during the pandemic.
I would think so.
I mean, that's on many of these slides, it's skewing the trend line upward just a little bit. I think Dr. Swift, and you pointed out about those years, and I think you pointed out more accurately than the trend line, that we're back to where we were. It's been pretty consistent with these demographic groups do show some variation, which I think are important. But even the 5 and 6 year graduation rates, which are, I think, going up. But again, they're also impacted because it's 20 and 21 is the final year on that.
Understand. Thank you.
If we go to slide 28, this is a similar look for our white students. We have a generally high performance and a trend line increasing over the 4 years. If we look at slide 29, this is for our economically disadvantaged students as measured by free and reduced price lunch. And we have, again, the trend line is increasing over time. And the 5-year rate for 2021 is as high as any prior 6-year rate, save one. And then slide 30 looks at our English learner students. So this is our biggest area of concern right now. And the one that we're working on, as you can see, this trend line is decreasing over time. This is our only one that is a decreasing trend line. Slide 31 goes into a little bit more context about that. So the short version is that we have more students with greater need in our English learner community than we have had in the past. So since 2017, our English learner population has increased by more than 22%, from 1,472 to 1,801. And of those, just under half are newcomers to the U.S., which is defined as having less than or equal to 30 months of schooling in the United States. And about a fifth of those with our the term is SLIFE, which stands for limited or interrupted formal instruction. So either they have limited instruction prior to coming to the U.S. and starting school here in 30 months or less from now, or they had some education and then it was interrupted by some event, Maybe it was a war, maybe it was something else, especially when you're talking about refugee populations. There's a lot of things going on that interrupts education. So we have more students who are EL, and they have a greater level of need than we've seen in the past. Some of the things that are already happening around this is that additional resources were added during this academic year with a focus on secondary English learners. And for the 23-24 academic year, there'll be further enhancements to EL programming across the district, including deeper levels of training for administrators and teachers.
I'm glad to see all of this. Actually, it's really important to understand the significant need and increase in numbers, but also that there's going to be more resources. If my memory is correct, based on when I retired in 2016, and I just have this anecdotal knowledge from teaching middle school. I know the middle school ELL resources dropped about that point. I know there were many teachers concerned about the level, and I apologize because that's a vague statement. So it's more of a question to research that delivery model. But again, there's clearly need to increase it. So, at some point, I'd be interested in the details historically and now and in the future.
Thank you, Trustee. It really is about the federal funding for EL learners. And we are spending general fund money as well. And we've added to that over years. It also is that we're proud to be a resettlement city. I know we're proud of that. I am. But the nature of this situation is dramatically different than it was before. So we have honestly, absolutely the best English language learner director I've ever seen. And I have asked Huda, and I know Ms. Parks and Ms. Linden have also, to just help us to share with you all some highlights of how we're enriching the program. Those of you that attended the newcomer fair, and even if you just heard about it, just the resources in terms of interpreters, translator, everything to really help our neighbors settle in to a school setting and then be able to focus on learning. It's amazing, the effort. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Trustee Beskat.
Thank you. I think that needs to be added to your slide, Dr. Berger, because again, as people who will be reading this after the meeting without benefit of the discussion, will again look at that number. We have some very critical people in our community, we have to acknowledge that, who look at anything to ding us. And when they see that, as Dr. Swift pointed out, we have worked with our nonprofits who have been very supportive in bringing our students, and they do what they can and help in matters of helping us, but they're limited, right? And we are the educational institution. Sometimes we get the additional fund money and sometimes we don't. We also have to consider too, and having worked with some of these families are afraid to ask for any more help. They are so grateful for what the community has given them. If there is an issue, an educational issue, some of which we could, as a community, as a school district, could easily rectify, they're afraid to ask because they think that's seeming ungrateful. So we have to consider that too. These are some children who have been in some horrible situations, yet they have survived and they are achieving. And yet, when you look at our numbers, we're dinged because our numbers aren't as high as another district who some districts refuse, their communities refuse to take the families that we take in terms of being refugees and newcomers, so to speak. So I think, again, I apologize, I was not on a committee to advise you. I would ask that you modify the final presentation that would be published to include that fact, because I think that's very important. And I think that needs to be recognized by everybody. And again, we, as Dr. Swift said, we're proud to take our families from anywhere. But we have to acknowledge, too, that our families may need additional support. And while we're trying to figure that out, our numbers will look a little different than the other districts. But I'm, again, we're all amazed by those students who manage to achieve successfully. And those are the scholars we hear with the $1 million scholarships who go on because they're very motivated. And so just want to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Trustee Schmidt.
A point that was brought up during committee over this discussion was also the factor of the extreme trauma. And we've had so many children go through trauma through all the pandemic. I mean, there's so many things, but it can be unique. And as a child in high school who's just showing up here in 9th grade, who has seen the things they've seen, and it's just really hard to break through and get an education. This is all an impact. So.
Mohammed.
And just to add to the EL discussion, but even just our demographics of the EL, the English language learners, could be very different from other schools. And I've talked to other EL, teachers and coordinators at other school districts, and they're like, oh, we're not seeing a lot of people from Afghanistan or refugees as much because it's going to change based on who we're getting as refugees, as well as the university brings a lot of EL students. There's a lot of people who come in for, one thing I know I brought up before is like they come in for like 2 years, and I've had colleagues, at the university where they come in for 2 years for a fellowship or training from China. They have kids that are in high school, they send them. So there's a lot of factors, I know, especially with EL and the EL program, but just something, I know it's hard, and I've asked this before, if we can look at like the demographics, really understand, how many are coming, speak whatever language or from a particular country or have refugee, it paints a very different picture than other districts as well.
Thank you.
I have a question. It's sort of like a three-pronged question, but we have this, as you pointed out, we have this chart of who's sort of closing in, right? Economically disadvantaged students on our 5-year line are doing really well. Students of 2 or more races seem to be killing it. Wondering if we know what we have done right for those groups, and also I'm wondering if we have any sort of intel about what our peer districts are doing as far as targeting the groups, where we're not necessarily doing as well as them. Like, do we know what they're doing? Like, do we know, are they doing graduate coaching with community partners?
Thank you for that question. Our team does sit with other districts, and Ms. Parks can speak to this also, but one of the best strategies that we're seeing are those graduation coaches. And when you reference districts that have a fundamentally higher funding level, they have hired grad coaches that live in every school, and their caseload, is to oversee and help and support a student with achieving their grad plan. Now, we added in 2017-18 9th grade deans, and we also added high school interventionists, but that is a very lean staff for, at any given moment, maybe 20% of a class population that is somehow off of an on-track plan. Do you know what I mean? In other words, they've missed a credit somewhere. So our teams do an extraordinary job. But if we had a magic wand, it would be, and we can ask Ms. Parks, it's her work every day, but one of them would be grad coaches. Yeah.
But we don't have that at every comprehensive high school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's part of the staffing at Pathways.
Yep, it's part of the staffing. We call them success coaches at Pathways, but we don't have them at all 3 of the comprehensive high schools. We do have more of the intervention specialists in 9th grade dean support at the other high schools.
And would you comment while you're there on the Edgenuity classes, that Trustee Carahara's question? about the credit recovery effort at the comprehensive location.
So we do have Grad Alliance for all schools, and that is an online program. But we also have at the schools Edgenuity that's offered during the school day, and it is staffed by our AAPS staff. So it's in person, and those classes typically max out at no more than about 15 students.
Can I just, since we're talking about, are they staying within their discipline, or are they across disciplines?
Across disciplines.
Okay, so one certified teacher might be supervising a student doing credit recovery across different disciplines, and that I would imagine
That's
would be
correct.
because of scheduling.
Yep,
And
that's
resources,
absolutely
right?
correct.
In funding.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that at every school? Ingenuity.
Edgenuity is, yes, at every school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I promise I'm almost done. So our slide 32, to finish off what we're looking at here, it looks at our students with disabilities over the last 10 years. You can see that the trend line is increasing over 4 years. You can see there's an increase in the grad rate from 21 to 22, which is this is one of our other groups that increased from last year. Students with disabilities has always been more likely to take advantage of the 5 and 6 year rate. So we see sort of less of a change over time in that, because that was baked into that program in a way that it wasn't in other programs as much over time.
Exactly.
So we don't see as much change in what happens in 5 and 6 years. I mean, it kind of bounces around, but we don't see like the trend we saw in some of the other groups. So moving on to dropout. Oh,
Well,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Before
Question on
you-
this one
you
first.
Go there. One of the challenges I can imagine, again, I've not done a deeper dive in the conversation, students with disabilities, that's such a broad category.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, a student with a mobility issue versus a student with a cognitive issue,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Yes.
it's almost unfair, and it can vary from year to year, right? In terms of who comes. What else do we know about this?
Given our size as a district and our position and our ability to deliver services, trustees, you're aware, we have medically fragile programs.
Absolutely.
Other districts might have a student here or there. We have whole programs for students with high levels of impact. We're proud of that. Because folks come to us to get that support and service. But it does show here. We talked a few years ago about a concerted effort to move more students to a diploma track, but we really have landed on cleaving to what is best for the student based on their IEP. So we have not driven folks to that diploma track. It needs to extend from the profile of the student need. And I know that there are districts who have really leaned heavily on personalized curricula and other approaches to get more of this group of students to the graduation column.
So would it be like the other categories where, again, it's a question, if we could keep them longer, we could graduate them? Or is that probably not in this subgroup? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. So as you can see in 2020, that high water mark there over several years of 82% at the 6-year grad rate. As Dr. Berger noted, what is awesome is that our system, our students with special needs do stay with us. And persist. But as you can see from the data, there is definitely a percentage they will not be in that graduation category.
So some of the students in the special ed population, the state says that we would service them to 26.
Yes.
So for them,
and they are in this group also.
yeah.
Yes.
And they're going to be beyond the 5 and 6. We wouldn't see them. They might hang with us for whenever.
Or potentially be a certificate and never be in this data. But yes.
Yeah. It's just very.
As are the students who depart, and and we don't know where they went, they're also not ever going to move columns.
That's a whole discussion.
Okay, it's coming up with the dropouts. Yeah.
All right, so I guess that's a great way to get into the next slide.
Yeah.
So slide 33 looks at our four-year dropout rate. So it's up a little bit from 21. Our four-year trend line is decreasing slightly over time. This is probably, I should have put this earlier because it came up much earlier in the conversation,
Yes.
but this gives us our definitions. So the first thing to know is that the graduation cohorts are based on ninth grade enrollment. So whoever is enrolled in a particular class at the ninth grade point, they are part of that graduation cohort unless something changes. So the different categories are on-track graduated. Those are the folks who finish in 4 years, sort of the quote-unquote traditional route, I guess. And that's what all the four-year graduation rates we're looking at are measuring, those four-year completers. A regular diploma in 4 years or less. There are other groups that are not part of the grad rate, but also do not count as dropouts. So that's these that are starred. So GED completers. If somebody leaves our schools, finishes their GED, they're no longer counted as a dropout, but they are also not counted as a graduate. Other completer. So for example, this is the special education certificate of completion that we've talked about, or they reach the maximum special education age. Again, not considered a dropout, but also not considered a graduate in 4, 5, or 6 years. Off-track continuing. This is a student who did not complete in 4 years, but we are expecting them to be continuing on to the 5 or 6 years. So those are not considered a dropout at that point, and they're also not considered a 4-year graduate. And then there's dropout. So that's someone who either left high school permanently at any time from the time they became part of our cohort at the beginning of ninth grade, or anybody whose whereabouts are unknown. So for example, if we have a student who is in ninth grade with us, and at some point in their sophomore or junior year or sometime during their high school career, they move far away, but maybe they move to, Montana. And for whatever reason, the school never requests their records. Michigan doesn't have any proof that they enrolled somewhere else. And so that student would be considered a dropout. So that's kind of the funny thing about the dropout rate is it's anybody who leaves that we don't see them either enrolled in another school in Michigan or have proof that they enrolled somewhere outside of Michigan at any point after their freshman year.
So that's just someone who leaves our district and never asked for a transcript, basically, to transfer their credit over to somewhere else.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, that could be. Now, if they go to another school in Michigan, then Michigan knows where they are because somebody claims them on student count day. But if they move out of Michigan or out of the country, and nobody asks for the records, yeah, they would fall into a dropout category. And then just the final sort of data slide here is the dropout rate for 4, 5, and 6 years over time. And again, if you kind of look, and squint, those are generally decreasing. But obviously, anybody dropping out, we'd like to avoid that as much as we can.
Trustee Schmidt?
So to me, that is just a very interesting way that the state identifies people, because I'm thinking, so as soon as you step into our schools as a freshman, you're now in that group.
Yes.
You could be a homeless child that is living with your aunt for that semester,
Yes.
but you're ours. And then if you move away out of state and whatever your circumstances are, but we never hear from you, we never hear from a school, we've got you listed as a drop. It just seems very interesting. And so that we have to look at our population and think about just the mobility rate.
Yes.
Of things. And it's very different perhaps in a small town where, people of many generations all stay. And I think that is a very unusual statistic or definition.
I would also assume that homeschooled, because I don't know that the state of Michigan keeps up with that, oddly enough.
You don't have to register.
You don't have to file your child to be homeschooled. There's no law for that, even though it's been tried to be passed for the safety of children.
And then So since I would also assume, just based on anecdotal evidence, that a lot more people began homeschooling during COVID, and so that affects that as well. Like,
and that's going to keep happening. You know, when there's a school shooting, or when that makes people more angst filled, and they decide I'm going to have my child home where they're safe.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're not asking for a transcript when they stay home.
Dr. Berger, I'm sorry to throw something out, but those who moved in, say in 10th grade year, parent is a professor, they move in, where do they land in this data? Inquiring minds want to know.
Once we claim them for funding, like on a fall or a spring count or an end of the year reporting, then they become part of that cohort. Yeah.
I see.
Yep.
So it's the 9th grade plus all the
correct.
move-ins.
Yeah, correct. Yep. Sorry, I didn't make that clear, but yes, that's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even if they move in and back out again.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. If they move in and if they move out and it's a situation where we don't have any way to know that they moved out officially, then they become part of the cohort, but then they disappear, possibly.
So back to Trustee Dupree's thing about what characteristics are we comparing by, mobility of community might be another one to put on our list. Yeah.
Well, and you know, as we know from the enrollment report that I do at the beginning of the year, we have a highly mobile district.
We do.
A lot of people come in and a lot of people coming out every year. So that is my part of the presentation, I believe. And I know that there's some wrap-up comments, and I will, of course, be here if there's some other questions that pertain to things that I can answer for you all. Thank you.
Excellent work.
yeah. Thank you. Trustee Bescott.
So I don't know if this is Dr. Berger or Ms. Park's question, but I'll turn to you, Dr. Swift. Our school districts, are we penalized if we have more students on the 5 and 6 year track versus not?
You know, that is a great question, and we talked about that on our team. I feel it isn't a penalty to us.
Right, it is a state.
But I know that those who look at the one rate, the 4-year rate, you know, there are folks who would only look at that rate.
Right.
But there are not any accountability. It is just that rate is not as widely reported.
Sure. So the state doesn't penalize us in any way. Because I'm looking at, it's just, to me, it's very similar to college graduations, right? Mm-hmm. We used to do 4 years. And I remember when I took my kid up for that parent orientation, they warn you right up front, you may be paying for a 5th year.
Right.
You know, which I'm glad they said earlier versus later, because we did end up with a 5th year. But again, a graduation was a graduation.
Yes.
We were happy to celebrate it the 5th year versus not at all. Mm-hmm. And we knew there were a lot of students who didn't finish. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if we should acknowledge that some students take longer.
Yes.
For whatever reason. And again, not see it as a penalty to any particular school or curriculum. Again, to me, it seems like personalized learning.
Yes.
I mean, if my kid had an interrupted year for whatever reason, then why would we expect him or her to finish it with the other quote unquote traditional students? So I was just wondering if there was a cost penalty.
Thank you. Really appreciate your sharing that. There are costs in staffing to educate, but we, I believe this board and boards prior, we love our students. We want them with us. We're fine if they take 5 years or 6 years. And I'm just proud that we've created a system where students can do that. And building the new Pathways building that will have that junior college look to it. It won't be as big of a building as that, but it'll have that more adult look. So it is well suited to students who may be chronologically a little bit older. They're not necessarily wanting to pull up to a comprehensive high school. That's not their thing anymore. We are proud of this work and proud of the progress we've made. And clearly we have a lot more work to do. There is a next step slide. The hour is late, but I just want you to know the team and I are excited to share this data and to do exactly what trustees you've noted, to dive deeper in the data so that we understand that 3% exactly, and we understand it at every school. We are on a path to build many pathways, many opportunities, and you see that every day in our system. We will also give some more thought to the use of personalized curricula, but we have never been a system that convolutes service to a child in the name of on-time graduation. And so we just haven't done that, but we will give discussion to that.
So if I can just talk about the personal curricula, because I think a lot of people don't know what that is.
Yes.
And I have a anecdotal story. I worked with a parent 10 years ago when this kicked in, and this parent's child had a learning disability, and she had taken Algebra 2 years, and she still could not. They tried to get her tutors, and I mean, it was really interrupting her getting through high school.
Yes.
And so the legislation didn't give any wiggle room. And then the law changed so that you could do a personal curriculum. And some school districts would offer economics, or they would offer personal finance. They tried to find other ways around to say, look, this child's the way this child's gifts aren't maybe for an Algebra 2 world. Let's find another thing that they can still excel in and still expand their ability to think and be a critical thinker. But that's what it is. It isn't, we're going to dumb down the curriculum so you can just take something so we can get you out of here with a diploma. It was really a thoughtful way of how do you take students and make sure they can still succeed.
Yeah. Thank you. That's how we want it.